Yes, although this Sunday sharing is spontaneous and usually unstructured, fairly informal, but I believe equally important. Sometimes we have some definite themes, such as the one we are going through the last couple of weeks, and that is a theme on the fourfold reliance, or the four reliances, Pratisarana, or Sanskrit Pratisaranena, a teaching that is common to all Buddhist traditions. We find them in the Pali, we find them also in Sanskrit and the Mahayana tradition, and also in Tibetan. This teaching constitutes an important guideline for us, especially today, to make decisions when we are confronted with certain teachings, certain situations, where things can be a little bit confusing, and where you have to ask the question whether a certain teaching, certain explanation is from the Buddha or not. And there's the very important criteria, the very important principle is that in a way it doesn't matter from what tradition it is, but it does matter whether it's from the Buddha or not. Something is taught by the historical Buddha, and then it is transmitted, in space and time. And we know that in the case of Buddhism, a very important historical understanding is that there was not such a thing called the original canon of Buddhism. We must not think in terms of an original canon in the same sense as, for instance, the Christian original canon, gospel. Well, for instance, it was composed in a particular language, maybe Hebrew, and in a particular form, propagated by a very specific community. And also in the case of Islam, the Quran was definitely compiled in a particular language, written in a particular script, in a particular form. But this is not the case as far as we know in Buddhism. Certainly, one can also speak of original canon in the sense that there must be something that is the earliest, relatively speaking, the earliest, but not in the sense that as the Christian Bible or the Islamic Quran and so on. And that is because of the very nature of Buddhism and the very attitude, or you might even say the linguistic policy of the Buddha, and he is non-authoritarian. He didn't want his teaching to be propagated, codified into a particular fixed so-called sacred language. And there is a story, I think you may be familiar, that you find in, again, all traditions. We have many, many versions of this story in the Pali, and also in the Vinaya text, preserved in Chinese, many versions, and from the Sanskrit and the Prakrit traditions, and also in the Tibetan. And this story speaks of two Brahmin brothers. They were Brahmins, and they were conditioned by Brahmanical kind of thinking and mental attitude. And in Brahmanism, they do have the idea of the original canon and the sacred language. And for them, language, the Vedas were inspired words by God, is of divine origin. And but the Buddha rejected the authority of the Vedas. He rejected the very idea of revelation by a creator God. And that's from the very, very beginning. These two brothers, having been Brahmin from the tradition for a long time, when they were converted, as it were, inverted commas, converted as Buddhists, and they decided to be a Buddhist monk. There were many, many examples like that. I think it's better to say that they were inspired by the Buddha and his teaching and decided to become Buddhist bhikkhus, and this is join the Sangha. And then they saw that the Buddha's teachings were recited in different dialects, and they were very hurt. So they went to the Buddha and said, Lord, your teachings are being recited in different dialects in different regions, and that is not good. And that is, in a sense, vulgarizing your teaching. Please have them, please instruct that they be codified into the Vedic Sanskrit language, that is to say, like the Veda text, the Vedic text. And the word is in chandaso. Chandaso is adverb, into chandas. That is referring to ancient Sanskrit. So these two brothers wanted to have the Buddha teaching in a sacred canon. And it's extremely important to note that the Buddha did not agree. The Buddha said no. And in fact, he thought it was very serious that some disciples were thinking like that. Of course, these two Brahmin brothers were requesting out of very kind and devoted intention. But the Buddha told them and all the other bhikkhus that it's wrong to think like this. And he said, listen, I want my teachings to be propagated in the different dialects of the different regions, in dialects of the people of the different regions, not in one fixed so-called sacred language. That is the wisdom of the Buddha. And that is you might call, as I said, the language policy of the Buddha that determines the development of Buddhism in a very important way. So therefore, from this story, which is common to all traditions, we know that it must have been an authentic tradition. It's not just a story. And that we know that from the very beginning, you can speak of a multiplicity of Buddhist canons. Not one single so-called original canon. Yeah. Of course, at the same time, you must realize that the dialects in those days were very closely related. It's not really a question of translating from one dialect into another. It's more, probably more appropriate to speak of transposing from one dialect into another. So it's not like today, when let's say the Bible is translated into say English and then into Chinese, and there are a lot of interpretations and linguistic error that way, but not in the case of the Buddhist canons. Although there were many canons, the dialects were very, very closely related. Today in India, everywhere, there are so many dialects. And if you speak of the original dialect of the Buddha, really you can't even say that it was Pali. But we know that it must have been a dialect that is very closely related to Pali. That much we can be very sure. So that's the importance of Pali. And speaking of the Buddha's own language, although of course, now again, tradition tells us Buddha-Gosa, for instance. Buddha-Gosa was the great authority, the great commentator for Theravada Buddhism, highly respected. But then also we have to be objective, and not everything he says was actually authentic. A lot of things he said were authentic, because he said that he composed the commentaries on the basis of the Puranas, of the ancient masters. So his commentary did flow from a continuous spiritual tradition, and that is the value of it. But of course, he also couldn't help bringing in contemporary interpretations and his own interpretations. Now, according to him, he would say that the phrase in that content, the story, that the Buddha's teaching be put into Sakaya Niruttya. Sakaya Niruttya. Nirutti is, you can say, language. In this context, or dialect. So in one's own language, but he interpreted own to mean in the Buddha's own language. Therefore, for him, you see, the Pali canon, Pali language was a Buddha's own language. That's how he believed it. But by the way, it's also wonderful. It may not be exactly correct, but that shows one thing, What is it? It shows that great learned Pandit, very learned scholarly monk, was actually deeply religious. And they have religious commitment. That's important. And for him, he has so much feeling for the Buddha and for the tradition. And he chose to believe that, when the Buddha said, my teaching must be put Sakaya Niruttya in own language, which means in his own language, which means Magadhi language, which means the so-called Pali. Well, Pali actually was not the name of a language in ancient time. The word Pali simply means a text, or the language of the text more correctly. You see? So that language came to be called Pali. So from this tradition, actually, we can see that the Buddha didn't allow this kind of authoritarian tradition to be perpetuated, and that also sometimes give us a kind of a problem, and or at least that also makes it necessary for us to be cautious when we are confronted with having to make choices, decision as to whether a sutta, whether a teaching was original from the Buddha or not. And this leads us to discuss the third reliance of the fourfold reliance. And that is, the Buddha says, we must rely on nītārtha, nītārtha in Sanskrit, and nītārtha is a Pali term, nītārtha-sūtra, and not neyārtha-sūtra. I have explained a little bit at the beginning. Nīta is a past participle. From ni is to lead, to lead, to guide, and so on. And nīta means let out, or has been let out. So, or has been drawn out. So we are told the neya, on the other hand, is a future passive participle. That means to be let out, to be drawn out, to be drawn out, sorry. So, not yet drawn out, not ultimate, not fully explicit, so they have to be drawn out. You have to decide, in other words, the spiritual message, and not just merely on the word. Now, of course, clearly this is related to the earlier criteria. For instance, we saw that the second criteria tells us to rely on the meaning and not the letter. You see? So actually these four, you can see that they are interrelated. And here, particularly concerning the discourses of the Buddha. Even if we find them as discourse of the Buddha, then we have to consider whether that particular discourse is meant as an expedient teaching, or is meant as a teaching directed at particular kind of people, particular kind of mentality, at a particular juncture, for a particular need of in order to help the audience, and that kind of teaching sometimes can be just a conventional teaching, a relative teaching, and we mustn't be completely attached to it as, representing the absolute word or message of the Buddha. On the other hand, there are other sutras, other discourses that are definitely expressive of the explicit. Explicit, you can use that English word to translate nītārtha. In Chinese, nītārtha is 了義經, neyārtha is 不了義經. The Chinese, it's difficult for the Chinese to express a future passive participle. Even to express a past participle is difficult enough. Because there isn't really a proper a passive voice in Chinese. And certainly no past tense in Chinese. But for future participle, passive future participle, it's even more difficult. So Chinese choose to render this form as 了義不了義. You can see the contrasting intention, contrasting meaning in these terms. So, for example, sometimes the Buddha say, "Oh, you have to be responsible for yourself, and you have to strive, and you have to be aware of your responsibility and things like this." Then the emphasis on you or I, Buddha said, speaks of himself. Then you must think that in Buddhism there is this metaphysical I, metaphysical you, metaphysical self, as the agent. But the Buddha is there talking, emphasizing on the responsibility, of karmic responsibility, and emphasizing that the individual must strive. Even the Buddhas can only point the way, you have to walk the way, and so on. So these kind of discourses may be regarded as neyārtha, as implicit, or not yet drawn out teachings. On the other hand, a discourse that speaks of all conditioned things as being impermanent, and all things as being without a soul, without a self, definitely are explicit teachings, are nītārtha or nītārtha teachings. So to make decisions in such a context, then we have to understand the Buddha teaching as a whole. That is always the principle. The overall consistency of the Buddha teaching. For instance, if you have a teaching that suggests a beginning of creation, the idea of a theistic creation, definitely it can't be the Buddha couldn't have taught like that, because if you look at the Buddha teaching everywhere, he didn't suggest anything like that. Or if a teaching that speaks of permanence of phenomena, so it can't be an authentic Buddha's teaching. Yeah. So then the test of overall consistency of the Buddha's teaching. That's why it's so important. And that also indicates that in Buddhism there is a place for study and understanding, and we should not shy away from that. We cannot just simply blindly follow tradition. And that goes back again to the first reliance, relying on the Dharma, not the Pukkala, relying on the teaching or the truth, not the person. Whether that person is a particular teacher, even the Buddha in the Kalama Sutta say, not be overwhelmed by the authority of the tradition, the scriptures, and even the fact that some teaching is taught by a teacher. My teacher said like that it has got to be correct. Of course, I have pointed out that there got to be a middle way, and that doesn't mean that we should have our ego and think. I know enough. I can decide myself. You have to be humble. That it's difficult for us to decide because our intellectual understanding is limited. And also we have to be aware of the importance, the spiritual importance of the inspiration of the teacher. That the idea of tuning into the spirituality of the teacher in order to be inspired by that, in order to learn by that. So learning from a teacher and receptively listening to the teacher, even accepting the teaching at least tentatively, this is very, very important also. So when we are told to rely on the Dhamma and not the teacher, it is not a teaching like the modern day idea of being rational, being logical, and being an individual, which really means nowadays to be individualistic, not being a true individual. You see, so it's not that. So likewise, in applying this criteria of reliance on the explicit teaching and not the implicit teaching, we mustn't develop too kind of over-skeptical attitude. That is a hindrance. You see, now in the Buddha's teaching, there are 10 fetters, 10-fold hindrance, you can say, right? That hinder us from spiritual attainment. One is actually doubt, vicikicca. That's extremely interesting. On the one hand, we are told that we have to learn to think and analyze and question. That necessarily involves doubt. On the other hand, it's extremely important, extremely spiritually significant to remember that if we just simply doubt out of our ego, as today is in a modern society, and self-attachment and presumptuousness, presuming that we know, I don't need to believe you. No, I'm a scientist. I'm a mathematician. I'm a clever man. I'm not emotionally weak, fragile. People think like that. I don't need religion. And you begin to doubt each and everything, or at least most of the things. Then you deprive yourself of the opportunity to tune into the teacher, tune into the tradition, tune into the holy, the sacred. You can't access higher levels of experiences. For instance, rebirth. For instance, nibbana. For instance, enlightenment. Well, we are certainly not at those stages yet. At least most of us are not. But we must open up. First of all, we must be receptive. If we are not open up, we are not receptive, then there's no hope of making spiritual progress. We cannot speak of being a spiritual practitioner. So that's a very, very important criteria. Doubt in an irrational sense, doubt in an egotistical sense, you see, is certainly discouraged in Buddhism, and it is taught as a fetter, and it has to be overcome. A person, a practitioner who attains stream entry, do you know what I mean? Who has come to the stage of the point of no return, the point of irreversibility in his spiritual struggle, in his spiritual progress. You know, once having reached that point, he will only sail on continuously, and in due course attained full enlightenment. That point is very important. That point, in a way, is in practical terms, you know, very, very important for us nowadays, you see, and it's more realistic to aim at that first, and to speak of enlightenment and all. Of course, we must continuously inspired by the very ideal of enlightenment to be Buddhist also, but as a near goal, I think we need to think of stream entry to come to that point. And now, according to the teaching, when one attains that point of no return, stream entry, one is completely free from irrational doubt. So in a way, you can even test whether a person has attained stream entry or not by observing whether the person is irrationally, you know, persistently, egotistically, self-attached in a certain manner, doubting everything, skeptical. That person can't be a stream entrant, for instance. So therefore, again, we have to understand the teaching of the Buddha, you know, in a you might say intelligent way. And here also, what I've said also constitutes itself an example. If you that is to say, if you have a discourse which speaks of the importance of doubt, and you want to ask, as a Buddhist, do I keep on doubting? I'm being a good Buddhist. I doubt even the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha's enlightenment, and the various possibility of spiritual progress. You see, so there seem to be some discourses, surely, you know, where you are taught to exercise your ability, your capacity to question, to doubt. For instance, the Kalama Sutta is one example, you see. On the other hand, you have also teachings which speaks of, just now, the spiritual hindrance of doubt on the path of progress. So we have to make decisions. And that had to do with the historical fact that the Buddha spoke according to sometimes, at least sometimes, according to the need of the situation. And that's important also. That makes sense. That is important because you know, the whole purpose of the Buddha was not to set himself up as a philosopher, not to set himself up even a consistent philosopher or thinker. I don't think of the Buddha as a thinker or philosopher, I told you. Because the Buddha attained, I choose to believe that Buddha attained full enlightenment. And that enlightenment is not a product of philosophizing. It's not a product of philosophical investigation. It's not a product of logical thinking. He saw into reality fully, perfectly. There was enlightenment. There's no question of a gradual, progressive, you know, development. You know, often in some modern expositions of the Buddha's teaching, even exposition even by the Theravada, some scholars, they have become too scholarly. They were influenced by the over-rational environment of modern time, and they want to present Buddha as being fully rational, fully logical, and they call Buddha an empiricist, and so on, and even some of them speak of Buddha as being a linguistic philosopher. You know what I mean? So I think it's debasing the Buddha's enlightenment. So these people, they say, oh, the Buddha originally spoke like this in simple terms, and then he was questioned, and then he rethink about it, and he revised the theory. Then he arrived at a better theory. I reject this, because this kind of account is an account of gradual philosophical, intellectual, logical development. This may apply to ordinary thinkers, because thinkers produce thoughts. Yeah, the products of thoughts are necessarily rational, logical, intellectual. But it's wrong to assume that the Buddha, or for that matter any great spiritually attained being, teacher in the world, gain the insight that way. At the earlier stages, yes, when the Buddha was struggling, when any spiritual teacher is struggling, they think, they analyze, and they try, and they improve on their understanding. But once the Buddha gained insight, that insight was final, ultimate, perfect. So we have to understand this way. Therefore, we have to learn to be also receptive. Although we have to apply, we have to learn to, I keep on emphasizing, we have to learn to tune into the Buddha, tune into the whole tradition. That's why we do puja. It's important to puja, because puja gives you a powerful tool to develop your spiritual yearning and emotion, and put you right into the proper mental state to tune in. You feel that you feel like you are ready. You want to listen to the Buddha. You want to learn from the Buddha, and so on. You want to learn from the teacher. You want to learn the tradition.